Hello, good to be with you, Joshua Farris, with Soul Science Ministries, where we come to talk to you about all things related to the soul, especially in relation to growing cultural issues of interest in science and related to the family, as well as in relation to the church. And so I want to talk to you briefly today about the soul in different cultures, because there are different conceptions of the soul. Um, in different worldviews, different religious perspectives. And it's a fascinating topic um, that, from many perspectives, transcends time and geography. This concept of the soul, from ancient rituals to modern psychology, the idea of this notion of the soul has captivated humanity across cultures and eras. Although today um, it's not perceived as all as exciting as it used to be. It's not oftentimes a hot topic, but it is an important one nonetheless. So let's explore this idea as it's interpreted in different ways and enduring and has made an impact on human experience throughout history. It is a universal idea, but there are diverse interpretations of it. What is the soul? The soul is often understood as the immaterial essence of the person, often associated closely with immortality, the seat of consciousness and emotions and identity. What nearly all cultures share this broad concept. And all cultures do historically share some notion of the soul, this idea of this immaterial core, this essence of persons. But the details vary widely. The soul is eternal and divine in some concepts, and often, or in some uh, traditions, religious and philosophical traditions, it often is linked to a higher power and connected to some transient force that lives beyond the body. But the soul's existence reflects our innate desire to understand what makes us who we are and what happens to us when we die. The soul's journey, um, beliefs about the afterlife. The soul's journey is often a metaphor used that we talk about. We talk about commonly in our lives, we talk about different paths that we take based upon different decisions that we make, or different things and people and places that come into our lives at different times that have and already are in important ways embedded in this sort of soulful, kind of meaningful framework of which we make sense of the world kind of around us. And so this becomes important across cultures. And it reflects different values, worldview perspectives, and traditions and rituals that are related to it, that are situated in this broader kind of meaningful framework, soulful framework of which the soul imbues meaning and purpose to these discussions. In ancient Egypt, you think of the life force or the Ka or Ba or something that was believed to enter into the afterlife. Um, uh, there were different ideas about the soul as related to the heart or to the mind. And in Hinduism and Buddhism, the soul again undergoes some kind of cycle of reincarnation until it reaches the ultimate goal of some kind of liberation and enlightenment. Of course, there are other ideas of the soul and across, kind of Western traditions about the rational part of man that transcends the kind of nature itself and makes sense of nature. Um, the soul has been embedded in ancient cultures. We see it across the Greeks from philosophers like Plato, who saw the soul as an immortal essence that actually seeks truth, and that by way of the soul we can find truth. Not by this sort of empirical method that's out there that we can rigorously test things and find truth that way. Aristotle saw it as the kind of the blueprint of the body, the kind of structure that makes the body what it is. Other indigenous cultures see the soul as interconnected with nature. As we see in Native American traditions, the soul is linked to the land, to the animals, to the actual place where these are actually imbued with spiritual meaning as being a spiritual realm themselves, and a very kind of earthy, kind of on the ground kind of way, in a kind of immanent way, where there's this holistic existence with them. But the soul is kind of, again, this structure, this meaningful structure that gives rise to place. Of course, in Christian tradition, we have something like that. When we think about our place, the land and the bloodline, the family line that we come from, the heritage, that's not just mundane reality, but it is imbued with a spiritual framework and a spiritual structure itself that is given to us by God, and the practices that we partake in terms of procreation and passing on the generation of and the passing on the Imago Dei, or passing on this whole you might say um, uh, inheritance to our children, is a spiritual practice itself, and it is already imbued in a spiritual reality of which the soul is closely tied and related to. Well, there are different spiritual practices and rituals that are related to the soul, that come out of the soul, or that are intimately tied or overlapping with the soul, rituals and spiritual practices that influence or connect with the soul, from meditation to ceremonies of honoring the dead. These practices highlight the soul's central role in cultural and religious life. They are meaningful, and in some real sense, from my perspective, from the perspective of soul science ministries, these provide a real, substantive, meaningful framework. They're not just sentimental. And so the anthropologists who are studying these things, these religious cultures, are not getting at the heart of the meaning of what's going on, because anthropology, often as it is, very much imbued in a kind of naturalistic framework, talks about these things in a kind of scientific way, but doesn't actually get to the heart of what's going on in a kind of soulful way. And so, in the Mexican tradition, uh, there's a practice where families that actually celebrate and honor the souls of their ancestors. In Tibetan Buddhist practice of, I don't I don't know how you pronounce this, powwow, where practitioners help guide the soul's transition after the time of death. There are various rituals that are practiced that show how the soul serves as a bridge between the living, or this imminent realm, and the transcendent realm, or the spiritual realm that is to come. So we also see the soul's significance centrally in a variety of literature in the West, including in Dante's Divine Comedy, an important piece of literature that all of us should read and be familiar with, as well as Rumi's poetry and other creative expressions that are found that express the soul's mysteries, that connect us to spiritual meaning, significance, and transcendence itself. What about the soul and the body? What is the relationship of the soul and the body? There's different views on this. There's different traditions. There's obviously the Platonic tradition, Augustinian tradition. Not totally unrelated, but often closely overlapping, is the Cartesian tradition, the Cartesian dualist tradition, that sees these entities, the soul and the body, as very distinct. And the soul is something that can exist independent of the body in some functional sense while it's embodied. Although this is commonly misunderstood, it is not separate from the body, but it is linked to the body. Others see the body and the soul as kind of just ingredients of one thing. Modern science is common today, treats the soul as something that is not investigatable. It's not something that can be disproven or proven from empirical facts alone. And so oftentimes, even within science and religion discussions, where there is some kind of naturalism in the background, the soul is kind of just dismissed as not real, or not taken seriously, and is not talked about much anymore, is not treated as having a kind of real framework that we should take actually seriously. Yeah, that's one view. Unfortunately, psychology itself, the psychology has been a discipline historically that utilizes the very term soul, but it treats it metaphorically because of its naturalistic framework and naturalistic influences that have occurred in psychology itself. Um, And so the soul itself has kind of lost its way in the psychology world, especially in academic psychology, in the way that we even treat patients. It's not treated as real or as a real entity anymore. And if it is, it's a kind of side issue that doesn't really or relevantly influence or shape the very psychological practices of psychologists and psychiatrists oftentimes today. That's not always the case, but it is commonly the case. And ironically, I had an article that was even fit Psychology Today. The style was written in a way that was very conducive to that particular audience, and the editors even said as much. Um, but they at the end of the day didn't accept it because they saw it as being too closely aligned with the soul and this ancient notion, and they basically said as much, so they didn't end up publishing it. It was too far away from their kind of rigorous empirical method and the kind of they didn't say this, but basically the influence of their kind of naturalistic inclinations, of which we're starting to see cracks in the psychological method, and we're starting to see these discussions open up and take more seriously consciousness in the mind, but the soul idea, not as much. Not, of course, we're seeing something like this in neuroscience, and even more recently, neuroscience has opened up discussions about the mind and consciousness, and less so the soul. But there's a close relationship. The time is ripe for this discussion to be opened up and to enter into these discussions and think about the soul and take it more seriously, even as we engage with the kind of scientific literature and the scientific conversations that are in the public realm. Neuroscience has experienced a kind of shift away from a kind of rigorous, kind of reductive materialism and taking seriously the idea that the mind can be studied by way of the brain alone, as if the brain and the mind are somehow identical, which they're not. But and many neuroscientists have in the literature, we're seeing an openness more toward the mind and consciousness as being something that is quite distinct from the brain. And so you can't just study the brain and expect that you're going to get to consciousness. So neuroscience itself is already presuming some kind of view that the mind and the brain are distinct, really and truly distinct. And so this opens up the door to further discussions about the soul itself. The soul is something that cannot be scientifically understood, at least in the common ways in which we think about the rigorous kind of empirical method or the naturalistic method of so common to many of the sciences today that take the authority or are perceived as authority disciplines. The soul's influence, of course, on the personal identity is profound and something that we should explore further. It drives our quest for purpose, meaning, and connection, and these are things that science and even psychology or neuroscience cannot give us or not fully explain. There are different global perspectives on the soul, different cultural differences about its nature in relation to the eternal, to the sacred, to human existence itself, to shared beliefs across traditions, and signifying a kind of universal significance. There's a kind of collective acknowledgement of something that's greater than ourselves, that's transcendent. At the same time, the soul's mystery endures. And there's something about the soul that points us to that mysterious part of life that makes it what it is and gives a kind of meaningful structure and framing for the world around us. And so there's no singular view on the soul across cultures. So as we wrap up, let's reflect on this journey as we think about the soul from ancient rituals to modern science. The soul continues to shape our beliefs, our practices, and our understanding of ourselves as it should. And we should be doing this even more so, more consciously as we think about these things. So what about you? How do you define the soul? How does it influence you? I encourage you to explore these things further. Thanks.